Forward! The mountains were a war against God's own stone. The muskeg was a battle with the earth's rotten heart. But the prairies were a war against the mind itself. In 1882, the Canadian Pacific Railway, having clawed its way through the granite of the Shield, spilled onto the great, flat expanse of the North American interior. To the financiers in Montreal and London, this was the easy part, a straight, flat line on a map. For William Van Horne, the railway's brilliant and brutal general manager, it was a race against bankruptcy, against political promises, and against the crushing, soul-destroying monotony of the landscape itself. He unleashed an army of thousands, Irish navvies, Scandinavian graders, English track, layers, with a single impossible command: build 500 miles of track in a single season. The result was a spectacle of human endurance and industrial ferocity the world had never seen. It was also the birth of the end of track town, a lawless, mobile city of canvas and sin that followed the construction like a vulture, bringing with it whiskey, violence, and despair. This torrent of steel and humanity cut directly through the heart of Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory, the ancestral lands of the Cree, the Blackfoot, and the Métis. For them, the prairie was not an empty space to be conquered, but a sacred inheritance. The railway was not a symbol of progress, but an iron spear pinning them to a future of starvation. With every mile of track laid, the great buffalo herds, the foundation of their entire existence, were pushed further toward extinction, their ancient migration routes severed by the unyielding iron rails. This is a story set in that feverish, violent summer. It is not about the grand strategies of generals or politicians, but about the people caught in the gears of the great machine. It is the story of a Métis scout, torn between the world of his ancestors and the lure of a wage, of an Irish gang boss, driving his men to the breaking point to outrun his own ghosts, and of a Cree elder, watching the sky for the smoke of the iron serpent and the dust of the last buffalo. It is a story of a time when the horizon offered no comfort, and the only thing moving faster than the railway was the approach of a bloody rebellion born from its shadow. Chapter 1. The tyranny of the horizon. The sky was an enemy. It was the first and last thought in Cormac, the bull, O'Malley's mind each day. It was not the soft, forgiving sky of his native County Mayo, a sky that wept and laughed and changed its mind a dozen times before noon. This sky, the sky of the Canadian prairie, was a vast, indifferent tyrant. It was a perfect, depthless blue, stretching from one end of the world to the other, a relentless canvas upon which the sun beat down without mercy. "A more steel," he roared, his voice a gravelly weapon against the silence. "Get the rails moving. Van Horne wants another 4 miles by sundown, and I'll not be the man to tell him no." His crew, 100-strong gang of Irish navvies, moved with a practised, brutal rhythm. They were the shock troops of the track, layers, the men who manhandled the 560-pound iron rails from the supply wagons and laid them on the freshly graded earth. It was back, breaking, soul-crushing work, a ballet of sweat and strained muscle. They worked with a furious energy, a pace that was both their torment and their pride. They were O'Malley's boys, and they were the fastest crew on the line. Cormac watched them, his shadow a stark, broad-shouldered line on the dusty ground. He was called the Bull for a reason. He was a mountain of a man, his fists like ham hocks, his face a testament to a life of hard knocks and harder whiskey. He drove his men without pity, but he drove himself harder. He was the first on the line in the morning and the last to leave at night. He demanded perfection because William Van Horne demanded the impossible. 4 miles of track a day, then 5, then 6, a pace that had never been conceived of, let alone attempted, The real enemy, however, was not Van Horn's schedule. It was the horizon. Cormac would stare at it, a perfectly flat, unwavering line that separated the pale grass from the blue sky, and he would feel a kind of madness creep in at the edges of his mind. There was nothing to break the monotony. No hill, no tree, no river bend, just the endless, soul-crushing sameness. A man could lose his mind out here, staring at nothing for too long. The work, as brutal as it was a kind of salvation. It was something to focus on, something to prevent a man's thoughts from wandering out into that vast emptiness and never coming back. A few 100 yards ahead of the track, layers, a different kind of work was being done. A small party on horseback moved slowly, almost gracefully, through the sea of grass. They were the scouts, the ones who rode ahead to ensure the path was clear of the unseen dangers the prairie held, the sudden, hidden coulees, the treacherous alkali flats, the vast, city-sized prairie dog towns that could cripple a horse in a single misstep. Leading them was a man who seemed a part of the landscape itself. His name was Jean-Louis Dumont. He was Métis, a man of mixed blood, with his French father's sharp features and his Cree mother's dark, knowing eyes. He rode his horse not like a rider, but like a man who was merely borrowing a piece of himself that had 4 legs. He did not fight the prairie, he listened to it. He could read the subtle shifts in the grass, the behavior of the birds, the scent on the wind, and know things that no white man's map could ever tell him. He worked for the railway for the same reason a man robs a bank, because that's where the money was. The buffalo were gone, the fur trade was a ghost, and a man had to feed his family. But every day was a quiet act of treason that gnawed at his soul. He was helping to build the iron road that was the instrument of his people's destruction. He was a guide, leading an army against his own home. He raised a hand, signaling his small party to a halt. He dismounted, his eyes fixed on the ground. To the others, it was just dirt. To Lou, it was a story. He knelt, touching the faint, almost invisible tracks. "Buffalo," he said, his voice a low murmur. "A small herd, moving fast. They were here this morning." His companion, a young, eager photographer from Toronto named William Finch, dismounted beside him, his eyes wide. "Buffalo, really. I thought they were all gone from this region. Finch was here to document the grand enterprise of the railway, to capture the heroic story of its construction for the papers back east. They are not gone," Lou said, his voice cold. "They are hiding." He looked west, his eyes seeing something beyond the horizon. "And they are hungry. The grass here is poor. The railway has pushed them from their old grounds." He stood up, wiping the dust from his hands. "And where the buffalo are hungry, the people are hungry. And where the people are hungry, they become angry." Finch, sensing a story, scribbled in his notepad. "Anger? You mean the natives? Are they a threat?" Lou gave a short, bitter laugh. "A starving man is always a threat, Mr. Finch. Not because he will fight you, but because his ghost will haunt you." He swung back onto his horse. "Let's go. There is nothing more to see here." As they rode on, Lou's gaze drifted south. He saw a faint wisp of smoke, almost invisible against the blue of the sky. It was not the billowing, greasy smoke of the locomotive. It was the thin, clean smoke of a campfire, a Cree camp. He knew who was there. An old man, a chief named Mistahi-maskwa, or a big bear. A man who had refused to sign the treaties, who had refused to be confined to a reserve. A man who still believed he could live the old way. A man whose people were now starving, following the last, ghostly herds of buffalo across a land that was no longer theirs. Lou felt a familiar pang in his chest, a mix of pity and shame. He was a Dumont, a name that carried weight among the Métis. He was related by blood and marriage to the great families of the Red River. He was also on the payroll of the Canadian Pacific Railway. He was a man walking a tightrope between 2 worlds, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the rope was about to snap. Back on the line, Cormac O'Malley felt the shift in the air before he saw it. The relentless pace of the work faltered. A murmur ran through his crew, a ripple of distraction. He looked up and saw the reason. A small party of riders, their figures shimmering in the heat haze, was approaching from the south. They were Cree. They were not warriors, but they were not supplicants either. They sat on their horses with a quiet, unnerving dignity, watching the chaos of the construction. "Get back to work," Cormac roared, though his own eyes were fixed on the riders. "They're just watching." Let 'em watch, but the presence of the silent, watching figures had changed the atmosphere. The prairie no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. It felt owned. The Irish navvies, men who knew what it was to have their own land taken from them, worked with a new, sullen tension. The endless, empty horizon now had eyes. And Cormac O'Malley, a man who feared nothing but the emptiness of his own mind, found himself unsettled by the gaze of the men who had been here first. The sky was still his enemy, but he was beginning to realize he was not the only one fighting a war against it. Chapter 2. The End of the World. The railway did not just move across the land. It dragged its own world with it. And that world had a name, the end of track. It was not a town. It was a plague, a mobile, chaotic, and profoundly dangerous collection of canvas tents, crude wooden shacks, and open, air saloons that sprang up, metastasized, and then vanished as the railway moved on. It was a city of men without women, a place of mud, whiskey, and casual brutality, and it was Cormac O'Malley's sanctuary. After a 16-hour day of fighting the prairie and his own men, Cormac would retreat to the heart of this squalor. He found a strange comfort in the chaos, in the roaring bedlam of a canvas saloon, surrounded by the shouts of gamblers, the tinny plink of a cheap piano, and the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. He could finally silence the tyranny of the horizon. The emptiness of the prairie was held at bay by the sheer, crushing press of humanity. He sat at a rough, hewn table, a bottle of rye whiskey, his own, not the watered, down poison the saloons sold, in front of him. He drank with the same focused intensity he brought to his work, each glass a measured dose of oblivion. The saloon, known simply as the Red Tent, was run by a hard-faced woman from Chicago named Sal, who was rumored to have killed a man with a bottle. It was the nerve center of the end of track, the place where wages were lost, deals were made, and lives were cheapened. Across the room, a group of his own men were gambling, their faces flushed with whiskey and greed. He watched them with a kind of detached contempt. They were good workers, the best on the line, but they were fools. They would pour their week's wages, a small fortune earned through sweat and agony, onto a greasy card table, and then wonder why they were still poor. Cormac didn't gamble. He had made his one great gamble when he'd stepped on the boat from Ireland, and he hadn't finished calculating his losses yet. It was in this purgatory of noise and desperation that Lou Dumont found him. The Métis scout stood in the entrance of the Red Tent, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the surrounding chaos. The saloon's inhabitants, a mix of Irish, Scottish, and Scandinavian workers, fell silent for a moment, their eyes turning to the newcomer with a mixture of suspicion and hostility. A half-breed was not a welcome sight in these establishments. Lou's eyes scanned the room, ignoring the glares, and settled on Cormac. He walked directly to his table. "Mr. O'Malley," he said, his voice calm and steady, "may I have a word?" Cormac looked up, surprised. He had seen the scout on the line, had a grudging respect for the man's quiet competence, but they had never spoken. "This ain't your kind of place, Dumont," Cormac said, gesturing to the hostel room. "State your business." "My business is the railway," Lou said, his gaze unwavering. "The same as yours. The Cree you saw today, they will be back. Their leader, Mistahi-maskwa, wishes to speak with the chief of the railway." Cormac let out a short, harsh laugh. "A chief? I'm a foreman. I'm the king of the navvies, nothing more. He needs to talk to the men in the fancy rail cars. They will not listen to him," Lou stated simply. "They see him as a nuisance. But you are a man who understands the ground. You are a chief of the men who do the work. He believes you will understand." "Understand what?" Cormac asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "He wants to show you something," Lou replied. "Tomorrow at dawn." He asks that you come alone to the ridge south of the line, the one that looks like a man sleeping on his side. It was a fool's errand, a risk with no reward. Cormac had a railway to build. He had no time for parleys with Indians. But there was something in the scout's eyes, a grave seriousness that cut through the whiskey's haze, and there was the appeal to his pride, a chief of the men who do the work. It was a title he had unknowingly earned, and it resonated more than he cared to admit. "Fine," Cormac grunted. "But if this is a trap, Dumont, I'll see you in hell." Lou nodded once, turned, and walked out of the saloon, the silence he had created quickly swallowed by the returning din. Cormac poured another glass of whiskey, his mind churning. He had agreed to a meeting that could get him killed, on the word of a man he didn't know, for reasons he didn't understand. It was the first interesting thing that had happened to him in 600 miles of straight track. The next morning, before the sun had breached the horizon, Cormac rode out alone. The prairie was a different world at this hour, washed in shades of grey and purple, the air clean and cold. He found the ridge easily. Lou was waiting for him, along with a dozen other Cree men. They were not painted for war, but they were armed, their faces grim. At their centre sat an old man, his face a magnificent ruin, his long grey braids hanging over a simple hide shirt. This was Mistahi-maskwa, Big Bear. The old chief's eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and intelligent. He looked at Cormac, taking his measure. He spoke in Cree, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, and Lou translated. "He welcomes you, chief of the iron slingers," Lou said. "He says you are a man who makes the earth tremble. He wishes to show you what you are destroying." Big Bear raised a hand and pointed to the east, where the sun was now rising, casting a golden light across the plains, and Cormac saw them. At first he thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light, but then he realized it was a herd of buffalo, not the small, scattered groups Lou had seen, but a true herd, thousands upon thousands of them, a slow, moving river of brown that stretched for miles. It was a sight he had only heard of in stories, a vision from a world he had thought was already dead. For the last of them, Lou translated the chief's words. They are the last great herd of the northern plains. They have come here for the spring calving. This is their sacred ground, a place of new life. Cormac stared, mesmerized. The sheer scale of it was biblical. The ground seemed to hum with the life force of so many animals. And then he looked from the herd to the south, where, even now, he could see the smoke of the grading crews. He could see the line of stakes, a neat, unforgiving arrow of wood and string, pointing directly at the heart of the calving ground. The railway was aimed like a loaded gun at the last remnant of this ancient world. "He asks you to move your iron road," Lou said, his voice heavy. "Go south. There is a pass. It will add miles to your line, but it will spare this place. It will spare the life of his people." Cormac tore his eyes away from the magnificent spectacle and looked at the old chief. He saw no threat in his eyes, only a deep, profound plea. Cormac was a practical man. He knew what Van Horn would say. The schedule was God. The straight line was its prophet. A delay of a week, let alone the months a detour would take, was heresy. It was impossible. "I can't," Cormac said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "I am not the chief you think I am. I am a foreman. I follow orders. The line is the line." A deep sadness settled in Big Bear's eyes. He had made his appeal man to man, chief to chief, and he had been refused. He spoke one last time, his voice a lament. "Then you will be the chief of a graveyard," Lou translated. "But your iron road will not carry life. It will carry the ghosts of all that you have killed." The old chief and his men turned their horses and rode away, leaving Cormac alone on the ridge. He watched the magnificent herd, a living, breathing miracle, and then looked at the smoke of his own railway, a relentless, unthinking machine of progress. For the first time in his life, Cormac O'Malley felt like a villain in a story much larger than his own. He was a builder. He was bringing civilization to a wilderness. But as he looked at the last great pulse of a dying world, he was forced to ask himself a question that had never occurred to him before. What if the wilderness was already civilized? Chapter 3. The Red Flag. The meeting on the ridge left a crack in Cormac O'Malley's soul. He returned to the line a changed man, though he would never have admitted it. He drank more, his temper grew shorter, and he drove his men with a new, savage desperation. He was trying to outrun the image of the buffalo herd, to drown out the echo of the old chief's words. But the memory was a stubborn ghost. For the first time the work felt not just hard, but wrong. He did what he could in his own gruff, indirect way. He went to the section engineer, a harried man named Roberts, and argued for a detour. The ground to the south is better for the grade, Cormac lied, his voice flat. It's less prone to flooding in the spring. It'll save us time in the long run. Roberts, a man who lived by the surveyor's map, barely looked up from his blueprints. The line is the line, O'Malley. Van Horn himself approved this route. We are not deviating for the sake of a foreman's hunch. Now get back to your men. The machine was too big, its momentum too great. It did not bend. The grading crews advanced, their ploughs tearing into the sacred calving grounds. The rhythmic clang of the track, layers followed, a funeral dirge for a dying world. With every rail he laid, Cormac felt as if he were driving a spike into his own heart. Lou Dumont watched it all with a quiet, burning rage. He had put his faith in the chief of the iron slingers, had believed the man's basic decency would prevail over his orders. He had been wrong. The railway was a beast with no heart, and the men who served it, no matter how powerful they seemed, were merely its slaves. The trust he had placed in Cormac curdled into a bitter resentment. His reports to the company became clipped, professional, devoid of the rich detail he had once provided. He scouted the path ahead, but he no longer shared the stories of the land. He no longer pointed out the eagle's nest or the badger's den. He simply did his job, his silence a wall between him and men like William Finch, the photographer, who seemed oblivious to the tragedy unfolding around them. "Isn't it magnificent, Lou?" Finch exclaimed one afternoon, as he set up his clumsy tripod and camera to capture. The relentless advance of the track, layers, the inexorable march of progress, a triumph of will over wilderness. Lou looked at the raw, bleeding scar of the railway, at the displaced earth, at the smoke that stained the perfect sky. "It is a triumph of something," he said, his voice so low Finch could barely hear it. "But it is not progress." The breaking point came a week later. As the railway pushed deeper into the valley, the buffalo herd, their calving grounds now a noisy, chaotic construction site, began to move, but they did not flee. Confused, hemmed in by the unfamiliar landscape of iron and men, they began to cross the newly laid tracks. A small group at first, then more, a steady stream of the massive, shaggy beasts wandering directly into the path of the construction. Cormac, seeing the danger, ordered his men to halt. "Hold the line," he bellowed, "let them pass." But the workers, many of whom had never seen a buffalo up close, reacted with a mixture of fear and excitement. Some shouted, waving their arms, trying to scare the animals away. Others saw an opportunity. A few of the men, company guards and foremen who carried rifles, began to take aim. No shooting. Cormac roared, but his voice was lost in the growing chaos. A shot rang out. A young bull stumbled, then fell. The sound of the shot and the smell of blood sent a wave of panic through the herd. The animals began to stampede, not away from the tracks, but along them, a thundering, unstoppable river of flesh and bone, directly toward the end of track. It was a scene from a nightmare. The terrified animals, weighing a ton apiece, crashed through the work site, their hooves tearing up the newly laid track, their horns tossing aside supply carts and tools like toys. Men screamed and scattered, running for their lives. The neat, orderly world of the railway dissolved into a primal chaos. From the ridge, Lou Dumont watched in horror. He saw the foolishness of the white men, their inability to understand the power of the natural world they were so casually destroying, but he also saw something else. As the main herd thundered past, a smaller group, mostly cows and their newborn calves, became separated, trapped in a coulee near the construction site. They were vulnerable, confused, and directly in the path of the enraged and terrified workers. At the same time, from the south, a new group of riders appeared. It was Big Bear and his warriors. They had been watching, and now, seeing the chaos, seeing the threat to the sacred calves, they were coming. They were not riding for war, but for protection, to guide the trapped animals to safety. But to the panicked railway men, who saw only a band of armed savages charging out of the plains, it looked like an attack. Indians, a foreman screamed. "We're under attack." The railway guards, their nerves already frayed, opened fire, not at the buffalo, but at the approaching Cree riders. A horse went down, then a man. The Cree, who had come in peace, returned fire. Cormac O'Malley, standing in the midst of the pandemonium, saw the situation spiraling into a massacre. He saw the fear and ignorance on his own men's faces, the righteous anger on the faces of the Cree. He saw two worlds colliding in a storm of blood and misunderstanding. He had to stop it. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a red flag used to signal danger on the line. He ran to the highest point on the grade, a small rise of earth, and began waving it frantically, placing himself directly between the two groups of shooters. "Cease fire," he roared, his voice a physical force. "Hold your fire, damn you all." Lou, seeing Cormac's desperate, suicidal act, spurred his horse and rode toward the Cree, shouting in their own language, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold your fire, they are confused. It is a mistake." Slowly, hesitantly, the shooting subsided. A tense, fragile silence fell over the prairie, broken only by the bellows of the frightened calves and the groans of the wounded. Cormac stood on the rise, the red flag hanging limp in his hand, a lone figure in the no man's land between two worlds. He had failed to move the railway, but he had, at the cost of his own life, perhaps prevented a war. Big Bear, his face a mask of grief and fury, looked at the dead warrior, then at Cormac. He gave a sharp, guttural command. His men collected their fallen comrade and began to retreat, their movements filled with a new, cold purpose. The plea for peace was over. A blood debt had been incurred. As they disappeared over the horizon, Cormac finally lowered the flag. He looked at the chaos of his work site, the dead buffalo, the wounded men, the terrified faces of his crew. He had tried to stop this, and he had failed. He had only delayed the inevitable. The red flag he held was no longer just a signal for danger. It was a prophecy, a symbol of the blood that had been spilled, and the blood that was yet to come. Chapter 4, An Act of God. The aftermath of the stampede was a grim tableau of chaos and recrimination. The railway's progress was halted for the first time in 1,000 miles. A full half-mile of newly laid track had been torn from its bed. The company's directors in Montreal would be furious, but for the men on the ground the delay was a secondary concern. The brief, bloody exchange of gunfire had poisoned the air. The Cree were gone, but their presence was a palpable threat, a promise of vengeance that hung over the camp like a shroud. An official inquiry was launched, led by a stern, faced north, west-mounted police inspector who arrived with a small detachment of red coats. He listened to the contradictory accounts of the railway men, most of whom, fearing blame, described a deliberate, unprovoked attack by the savages. Cormac O'Malley's testimony, in which he described the accidental nature of the conflict, was dismissed as the ramblings of a man who had been too close to the situation. His desperate act with the red flag was seen not as heroism, but as a reckless endangerment of the line. He was officially reprimanded, stripped of his authority as gang boss, and demoted to a common navvy. The bull, the king of the track, Layers, was humbled. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but it was nothing compared to the weight of his own conscience. He had stood on that ridge and seen the future, and then he had stood by and watched it come to pass. The demotion felt less like a punishment and more like a just penance. Lou Dumont, too, faced the inquiry. His account, which corroborated Cormac's, was treated with even greater suspicion. As a Métis, his loyalties were considered divided by nature. He was placed on temporary leave, a polite term for being fired. The company had no more use for a scout who spoke of ghosts and hungry people. He was paid his final wages and told to be gone by morning. That night, the two outcasts found each other in the darkness, on the edge of the now silent end of track. The raucous energy of the saloons was gone, replaced by a tense, fearful quiet. The company had imposed a strict curfew and a ban on whiskey, a move that did little to improve the men's morale. "So, they've put the bull in a pen," Lou said, his voice a low murmur in the dark. There was no mockery in it, only a shared sense of defeat. "And they've blinded their own eyes by sending you away," Cormac countered, taking a swig from a hidden flask. He offered it to Lou, who accepted it with a nod. They drank in silence for a moment, two men from different worlds, united by a truth that no one wanted to hear. "What will you do?" Cormac asked. "I will go north," Lou said, his gaze turning to the star-dusted sky. "To Batoche. There is a man there, a man named Real. He is gathering the Métis. He speaks of a new nation, a place for our people. He speaks of fighting for our rights." Cormac, an Irishman who had seen the futility of fighting an empire, shook his head. "That is a fool's path, Dumont. It leads only to a hangman's noose. Perhaps," Lou said softly, "but to do nothing is also a kind of death. Your people know this, I think." He handed the flask back to Cormac. "And what of Big Bear? He will not let the death of his warrior go unanswered. The blood debt must be paid." As if in answer, a new light appeared on the southern horizon. It was not the gentle glow of dawn. It was a flickering, angry orange, and it was growing. A murmur of alarm began to spread through the camp. Men stumbled from their tents, their faces pale in the eerie light. It was a prairie fire. A massive wall of flame, miles wide, was sweeping toward them, pushed by a strong night wind. The dry summer grass, which had sustained the buffalo for millennia, was now the fuel for a conflagration of apocalyptic scale. Panic erupted. The railway camp, a marvel of industrial efficiency, dissolved into a terrified mob. The men were trapped. The fire was moving faster than a horse could run, and the railway line, their only path, ran directly into its heart. The engineers and foremen, the men with the blueprints and the schedules, were powerless against this elemental force. Cormac and Lou stood on the small rise, watching the approaching apocalypse. "Is this his answer?" Cormac asked, his voice filled with a strange awe. "Is this Big Bear's revenge?" Lou shook his head. "The people do not use fire as a weapon. It is sacred. This is not the work of man. This is the land itself, cleansing its wound, an act of God, as your priests would say." As the first tongues of flame began to lick at the edges of the camp, and the air grew thick with smoke and ash, a desperate plan was formed by the railway engineers. They would save the locomotive. They hooked up every available flat car, creating a long, skeletal train. They would load it with the most valuable equipment and the most important men, and make a run for it, straight through the fire, hoping the speed of the engine and the iron of the tracks would protect them. It was a mad gamble, a race against the inferno. Cormac, as a disgraced navvy, was not among those chosen to board the train. He was left behind with the rest of the expendable workers to face the fire as best they could. But as the locomotive began to build steam, its whistle a frantic scream against the roar of the flames, Lou Dumont grabbed his arm. "Come," the scout said, his voice urgent. "I know a place." He led Cormac away from the chaos, not toward the railway, but toward a shallow, marshy slough that lay a quarter-mile from the camp. It was a place the railway engineers had dismissed as useless swampland. To Lou, it was a sanctuary. "The fire will pass around us here," he explained as they waded into the knee-deep water. "The ground is too wet to burn." From the relative safety of the slough, they watched as the great wall of fire descended upon the camp. The canvas tents and wooden shacks vanished in an instant, consumed by the roaring furnace. They saw the last train, a black silhouette against the wall of orange, begin its desperate run. It gathered speed, plunging into the heart of the fire, a mad, heroic, and ultimately futile gesture. Halfway through the inferno, a wooden trestle bridge, its timbers dried to tinder by the summer sun, collapsed. The train, with its cargo of men and machines, plunged into a fiery ravine, its death cry a terrible shriek of twisting metal. Cormac and Lou huddled in the water, the heat so intense it scorched their lungs, the smoke so thick it blinded them. They watched as the grand enterprise of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the pride of a nation, the inexorable march of progress, was utterly and completely annihilated by an enemy it could not survey, could not bribe, and could not conquer. The prairie, the vast, empty, silent land they had sought to tame, had finally given its answer, and its answer was fire. Chapter 5, The Ashes. Dawn broke on a world erased, the fire had. Past, leaving behind a blackened, smoking landscape that stretched to the horizon. The vast indifferent sky was now a greasy yellow-grey, thick with haze. The air, once clean and sharp, was a choking miasma of ash and sorrow. The silence was absolute, the silence of a graveyard. Cormac O'Malley and Lou Dumont emerged from the slough, their faces and clothes stained with soot, their eyes red, rimmed and raw. They were two of the few hundred survivors from a workforce of thousands. They stood in the heart of the devastation, looking at the ruin of what, only yesterday, had been the proudest achievement of the British Empire. The end of track, with its chaotic, vibrant life, was gone. The railway line, the symbol of unyielding progress, was a twisted, melted ruin. The great locomotive, the heart of the enterprise, lay shattered in a ravine. It was the end of the world. The survivors wandered through the ashes like ghosts, their faces blank with shock. The rigid hierarchy of the railway had been incinerated along with the tents. Foremen, engineers, and navvies were now all equal in their shared misery. They were alive, but they were stranded, hundreds of miles from civilization, with no food, no water, and no shelter. The prairie, which they had seen as an obstacle to be overcome, had turned them into supplicants, as helpless as the starving people they had displaced. What now? Cormac asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The bull, the man who had always had an order to give, was adrift. There was nothing to build, nothing to command. There was only survival. Lou scanned the horizon, his scout's eyes searching for a sign, a story in the desolation. Now, he said, his voice quiet but firm, we learn to live on the land instead of on top of it. In the days that followed, a new social order began to form, one born of necessity. The men with the blueprints and the engineering degrees were useless here. Their knowledge was of a world that no longer existed. The new leaders were the men who possessed the old knowledge. Lou Dumont, the disgraced Métis scout, became the most valuable man in the camp. He knew where to find water, digging into the low, lying areas where moisture still clung to the soil. He knew which roots, laid bare by the fire, were safe to eat. He knew how to read the flight of the few surviving birds to predict the weather, and Cormac O'Malley, the demoted foreman, became his unlikely lieutenant. The bull's authority had once come from his position in the company. Now it came from his sheer, indomitable will to survive. He organized the desperate men, his roar once again a tool of command. He put them to work building crude shelters from the scorched earth and the twisted metal of the railway. He maintained discipline, crushing the squabbles that broke out over the dwindling rations with his fists and his force of personality. He and Lou, the two outcasts, formed a strange, unspoken partnership, a bridge between two kinds of knowledge, two kinds of strength. One morning, as they were surveying their ragged band of survivors, they saw figures approaching from the west. It was Big Bear and his people. They were not riding as warriors, but as emissaries. Their faces were grim, but they carried no weapons. They brought with them bundles of dried meat and skins filled with fresh water. The railway men, who had been taught to see these people as enemies, as savages, watched with a mixture of fear and disbelief as the Cree began to distribute the food and water. They gave freely, without a word. their actions a quiet testament to a code of ethics the white men could barely comprehend. Cormac found the old chief, with Lou translating. "Why," Cormac asked, the single word encompassing all his confusion, "we destroyed your land, we killed your people. Why are you helping us?" Big Bear looked at the Irishman, his ancient eyes holding a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "The fire was the land's judgment, not ours," Lou translated. "The land does not distinguish between the man who swings the axe and the man who gives the order. It purifies all. Now you are no longer railway men. You are just men, and a man does not watch another man starve." He looked from Cormac to the blackened plains. "This land is hard," the chief continued. "It has always been hard. To survive here, men must help each other. It is the first law. You have forgotten it. We have not." In that moment, standing in the ashes of his own arrogance, Cormac O'Malley finally understood. He had come to this country to build a railway, a thing of iron and force. He had believed in the power of straight lines and brute strength. But he saw now that the true strength, the strength that endured, was the strength of a community, the strength of a people who understood that they were a part of the land, not its master. He looked at the Cree, sharing their meagre supplies with their enemies, and he felt a profound and humbling shame. The relief party from the east arrived a week later, guided by the pillar of smoke that still hung in the sky. They found a scene that defied their expectations. They found the survivors not as a panicked mob, but as an organized camp. They found the white railway men living side by side with the Cree, sharing food and shelter, their old animosities burned away by a shared catastrophe. As the survivors were being evacuated, Cormac sought out Lou Dumont. The scout was preparing to leave, not with the railway, but with Big Bear's people. "Will you still go to Batoche?" Cormac asked. Lou nodded. "The fire has changed nothing. The railway will be rebuilt. The government will still come. The fight is not over." He looked at Cormac, a rare, small smile on his face. "But today I have seen something new. I have seen that not all white men are blind." He held out his hand. "Good luck, chief of the Iron Slingers." Cormac shook his hand, a gesture that bridged two worlds. "And you, Dumont, may your path be straight." As Cormac boarded the relief train, he looked back at the blackened prairie. It was a scene of utter devastation, but for the first time he did not see an empty wasteland. He saw a place of terrible beauty, a place with a spirit and a memory. The railway would return. The straight line would be re-imposed, but something fundamental had shifted. The bull had been humbled. The man who had come to conquer the prairie had, in the end, been conquered by it. And as the train began to move, carrying him back to the world of schedules and blueprints, he knew that he would forever be haunted, not by the ghosts of the men he had lost, but by the ghost of the man he had been. Epilogue. The North-West Rebellion of 1885 was a brief and brutal affair. The Métis, under the messianic leadership of Louis Riel and their Cree allies, including the starving bands of Big Bear, fought with the courage of desperate men. But courage was no match for the Gatling gun. The Canadian government, using the newly rebuilt railway to transport troops and supplies with astonishing speed, crushed the uprising in a matter of months. Louis Riel was tried for treason and hanged. Big Bear, who had advocated for peace but had been unable to control his hungry warriors, was sentenced to prison, his spirit broken. The last vestiges of resistance on the prairies were extinguished. The straight line of the railway and the square plots of the farmsteads that followed had won. The age of circles was over. Years later, in the burgeoning city of Calgary, a new railway station was being built. It was a grand affair of stone and steel, a testament to the power and permanence of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The foreman overseeing the foundation work was a large, grey-haired man with a face like a road map of a hard life. He was quiet, sober, and commanded the respect of his men not through fear, but through a deep, weary competence. His name was Cormac O'Malley. He He had never regained the title of gang boss. The reprimand from the fire had followed him, but he had found a different kind of authority. He was known as a man who understood the ground, a man who listened to it. He built foundations that never settled, walls that never cracked. He had learned the land's language in the ashes of the great fire, and he had never forgotten it. He was a builder, but he no longer saw himself as a conqueror. He was a negotiator, forever seeking a fragile peace between the unyielding ambition of men and the ancient patience of the earth. One afternoon, a group of Métis freighters, their distinctive Red River carts laden with goods from the north, passed by the construction site. Cormac watched them, his eyes scanning the faces, a habit he had never lost. He saw a man leading the train, a man with sharp features and dark, knowing eyes, and his heart skipped a beat. It was Lou Dumont. Lou had fought at the Battle of Batoche, had been captured, and had served a short prison sentence. He had lost his fight for a new nation, but he had not lost himself. He had returned to the old life of the freighter, the master of the prairie trails, a living link to a world that was vanishing. He was a survivor, a man who had learned to walk in the spaces between two worlds. Their eyes met across the dusty street. There was no animosity, no resentment, only a quiet, shared recognition of the journey they had taken. They were two old soldiers from a forgotten war, a war that had been fought not with guns, but with fire and pride and a profound, tragic misunderstanding. They did not speak. They did not need to. With a single, slow nod, they acknowledged the bond that had been forged in the ashes, the truth they had learned together, that the land endures, and that the strongest lines are not the ones drawn on a map, but the ones that connect the hearts of men. Lou Dumont led his carts north, toward the disappearing horizon. Cormac O'Malley turned back to his foundation, ensuring its line was true. The railway was finished. The world it had created was here to stay. But in the quiet moments, when the wind blew from the west, Cormac could still hear the whisper of the old chief's voice, and he could still see the ghost of 1,000,000 buffalo, running forever across the endless, unconquerable sea of grass.